Good evening, everybody. So we are very excited to have Anthony Townsend here talk about his new book, Smart Cities, Big Data, Civic Hackers, and the Quest for a New Utopia. Just want to thank you all for coming. Also want to just thank the New America Foundation event staff, which makes these events possible, and for my colleagues who are working here and are going to be sharing their remarks after. So Anthony Townsend is the research director for Institute for the Future, and he's somebody I've known for quite a long time through his work with New York City Wireless and on the Broadband Advisory Committee for New York City Council and Mayor's Office, where I spent quite a bit of time speaking to the committee and finding a great voice of sanity. You know, Anthony really was able to sit between the sort of nonprofit perspective, the community perspective, industry and business in a great way. And really excited about this book. I feel like this is a book that I've been hoping would exist, and Anthony has brought it to us. I mean, one of the things, as a New Yorker, resident of various cities, you know, one of the things I love about cities is that they're records of our successes and failures. They carry those in them, and I think that this book will really captures this battle right now, this struggle of whether we're going to combine the lessons of the past with the power of technology, or simply compound the mistakes of the past with mistakes of technology. And I think Anthony has really charted this critical juncture quite well. So Anthony is going to give a presentation ranging across the contents of the book, touching on the many topics that this hits on, and I'm excited that we have a panel to respond to the book from across New America Foundation's programs. We have Greta Byram, who is a senior field analyst with myself in the Open Technology Institute. We have Lena Kahn, who's a policy analyst with Markets, Enterprise, and Resilience Initiative, looks at issues of political economy affecting metro areas. We have Reed Kramer, who's the director of the asset building program at New America Foundation. So we'll, after Anthony talks, we'll have an opportunity for each one of them to respond and connect the conversation to some of the larger themes that we work on here at New America Foundation. And then after that discussion, we'll have a chance for Q&A. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Joshua Breitbart. I'm the Director of Field Operations for the Open Technology Institute. And again, very happy to have Anthony Townsend with us. And please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks to everyone at the New America Foundation for hosting me. I was driving in today on the empty streets of Washington, D.C., thinking about how I got interested in this topic. And does anybody remember the Office of Technology Assessment? There we go, got a couple hands there, okay. So that was another dysfunctional Congress in 1995, I think, decided to get rid of the Congress's basically technology policy evaluation arm. But it was one of the last reports that came out of that office called The Technological Reshaping of Metropolitan America that landed on my desk as an undergrad in urban studies at Rutgers University. Frank Popper was a professor there. He said, oh, you're interested in the internet and cities, you should take a look at this. And that was sort of really, I think, where the seed for this book started. More recently, it was a project that was funded by the guy who just appeared and then disappeared very briefly. I don't know, we just lost, okay. Benjamin de la Peña at the Rockefeller Foundation, who called up the Institute for the Future in 2010 and said, look, the foundation's really interested in big data and cities and this growing intersection of urbanization and ubiquitous computing, but we're really concerned about what it means for the poor. And so over the course of the next year, I talked to pretty much everybody who was thinking about intersection of cities and technology, trying to chart what the next 10 years was going to look like, and both what the opportunities for economic development were, both in the US and abroad, as well as some of the risks. And Benjamin was really concerned by some of the projects that he had seen in the developing world that purported to use technology to uplift the poor. Most notably was a project called Boomi in Bangalore, which was a basically an electronic records program for land titles. And what the World Bank thought when they funded the project was, hey, this will be great for squatters because they can assert their land rights, get tenure to their land, and then all the good things that flow from that. What happened was it just centralized corruption that used to happen at a village level, at the provincial level, where the records were kept. And instead of villagers bribing local officials to get their land records, it became developers, expat developers, some of them in New Jersey, getting on the internet and being able to acquire all this land that was being developed around a very rapidly growing city. And so it was this kind of unintended consequences that we focused a lot on. There's so many new digital services, so many innovations that are being launched right now. And the focus was really just on the benefits, the purported benefits. And so we wanted to understand, as this whole movement to build smart cities, IBM calls it smarter cities, Cisco calls it intelligent urbanization. What's the downside? Looking back at all the mistakes of city building over the last century, what kinds of mistakes are we making now? And that's really what I set out to do with this book. Now, if you look at some of the kind of metaphors that people are using to describe what it means to be kitting out our cities with sensors and digital networks that aggregate all that information, and then software that can analyze it and try to see patterns. They're incredibly simple-minded in a lot of ways. And part of that is because they're trying to communicate incredibly complex technological policy concepts very quickly. And they're often talking about stuff that's totally invisible. So one of the things that always drives me crazy is why urban planners don't care about telecommunications. And a simple reason is because they can't see it. They can't put their hands on it. They love trains, they love housing, they love all that stuff. But if it's invisible, forget about it. This is a picture that Carlo Ratti at MIT, who was one of the early pioneers in thinking about sensor-enabled cities, uses. And he basically describes smart cities as Formula One race cars. So it used to be, 20 years ago, if you wanted to win a Formula One race, you got a really good driver and you built a really good car and you sent them off on the track and let them do their thing. Now these cars have hundreds of sensors in them that are collecting all this data and streaming it back to the pit. And the guys in the pit crew are like data scientists now, trying to analyze what's going on with the car and the track and even the driver, and feeding it back to try and manage the race better. And I'm not so sure that that's a great way to think about a city. It's inherently undemocratic. It's very mechanical. It takes sort of all of the different interests that stakeholders in a city have and boils it down to one thing, which is efficiency. So that's sort of the point of view, I think, of the future of the city that I was trying to react to in this book. And then the other thing that was going on was that we were crossing a couple really important thresholds in the development of cities and the diffusion of technology, and the two of them coming together. And as I sort of went back and wrote the introduction for the book, I realized that 2008 was a really important turning point. So it was the year that the world's population became predominantly urban for the first time. It was also the year that there were more mobile broadband subscribers than fixed subscribers globally. So the internet became an untethered thing. And it was also the year that there were more objects, devices connected to the internet than people. And so we went from a world, a rural world of fixed internet communications, mostly for people, to an urban one of mobile communications, much of which will be about things talking to each other in the world around us rather than us talking to each other. And then the other big thing that happens, and this is when the technology industry really starts to develop and assert its vision of what a city built on information technology should be, is that the recession happens, and corporate IT spending falls off a cliff, and stimulus spending starts to ramp up. So the IBMs and the Ciscos and the Siemens of the world are very quickly trying to figure out how they can take the technologies that they built to run global enterprises and turn them to the problems of local government. And you start seeing literally $100 million plus marketing campaigns ramp up. I mean, if you've been through an airport or opened The Economist in the last 5 years, you've seen these ads. And they're purporting really remarkable claims. So buildings that bring down their own energy costs. Oh my God, that's amazing, right? Like, if we just buy something from IBM, we've fixed global warming, basically. Drivers can see traffic jams before they happen. Remarkable, right? So if you're a mayor walking through the airport and you're facing an election in the imminent future, you have to pay attention to this stuff. You have to get the IBM guys in the door and say, how can you help me get some of this? And mayors all around the world have been responding to this urge, if not to actually be building smart, but at least looking smart. And this is the Intelligent Operations Center that was built in Rio de Janeiro over the last couple of years. IBM was the main technology integrator for this facility. And this is basically a mission control center for a city that up until very recently was considered ungovernable. Richard Norton at the Naval War College listed Rio as one of his feral cities in, I think, a 2001 article, where he was basically applying the whole failed state concept to urban government. Not long after they announced that the Olympics were going to be in Rio, back in 2010, there's this widely seen footage of a police helicopter getting caught in a crossfire between two drug gangs. So this is the city that's saying, we're going to run a great Olympics and a great World Cup. And you have basically open warfare in the streets. And so this facility, which brought together all different branches of city government, piped in video feeds from all around the city, was basically trying to show the world that we can leverage technology to address these totally intractable urban problems of governance in a place like Rio that, has a terrible legacy of slavery and inequality and really poor decisions around infrastructure. But if we just put this box in place with some nice software, and they had this whole thing, this whole story around it, that this was actually the mayor responding to flooding that had caused, sudden flooding that had caused mudslides in the favelas and destroyed a bunch of housing. So the centerpiece of this was actually a weather modeling program that could basically predict precipitation 48 hours in advance. I don't buy that narrative. I think this was well underway already, but it's sort of, to me, this exemplifies this very corporate, technocratic kind of top-down approach to thinking about what a smart city is and the role that government plays in it. My favorite part of this project is the infomercial video that they produced, where they're like, this is the Intelligent Operations Center, and then they cut to this shot and they say, it's the biggest screen in Latin America, as if that's like a measure of good governance. So, these things I think are really suspect. And it's not just places like Brazil where you've got mayors who need to look good for the next election. Places where mayors don't get elected are really interested in this vision as well. So this is a snapshot from a movie that Cisco made for the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, which is arguably the most important World's Fair since New York, 1939. And it's these city managers are sort of like Greek gods looking down, playing, moving people around during as a typhoon approaches, pushing buttons and literally like changing the path of people's lives. And again, it's this view that running a local government is basically the same problem as running a logistics network, and ignores the fact that government doesn't work like a business. And your best laid plans are going to be thwarted by a group of senior citizens who don't want you to do what you had planned to do in their backyard. And just as these companies, I think, have treated government like an enterprise or a business, they look at citizens as consumers, as sort of people who are acting rationally and can be easily influenced or easily steered. And I think the idea that you're going to install a smart city from the top down through project like what happened in Rio is going to be resisted by people because you're taking power away from them. And I think that sort of my hunch was that you would get a much more sustainable effort in building a smart city if you engage citizens. And I started looking back through the history of urban planning for precedents to this sort of smart cities project. And the obvious one is what happened with the disruption that happened around motorization and bringing cars into the city. And I immediately thought, okay, IBM is just like the new Robert Moses plowing Cross Bronx Expressway through the city. And Moses used to say great things like, it's easy to plan cities like Brasilia or Chandigarh when you can just lay it out on a green field, but when you work in an existing city, you have to hack your way through with a meat axe. And I mean, it's a terrible metaphor to think about someone taking a meat axe to a living neighborhood. And he really reshaped New York City around the automobile, and a lot of it was done through the inspiration that was provided by General Motors at the 1939 World's Fair. And so I started thinking, is what Cisco's doing in Shanghai just the same song again, with a different set of technologies? And again, leaving citizens out of the process, I think, is a formula for disaster. And you see what happened with Moses in New York. A group of housewives in the West Village organized incredibly effectively and stopped his planning juggernaut, Jane Jacobs being sort of the cheerleader. And not only did they stop Moses, they completely emasculated urban planning. If you're interested in sort of the history of this, Tom Campanella at Cornell wrote a really great piece last year on it. And we're still recovering from this backlash to an abuse of power on behalf of Moses. And I think that the lesson here is that we shouldn't throw out the ideas that these big companies have and the technologies that they're bringing to bear, but they need to be balanced. And if you look all around the world, even in places that don't call themselves smart cities like Cairo, social conflicts that are coming to the forefront because of rapid urbanization. And there's a growing number of people who are saying that that's what the Arab Spring is about. It's about social tensions created by an influx of very young people into very large cities and no economy to support them. And so that's why you see all this turmoil. And these battles are being waged on both sides with vast amounts of technology. So, during the Arab Spring, government intelligence agencies were talking, cutting off cell networks, cutting off internet access. There's extensive video surveillance being used, extensive mining of social media to understand, who to go arrest in the house-by-house hunts. And on the other hand, we all know about the use of social media to organize the protests. Occupy was one of the most sophisticated uses of technology to create alternative systems of governance. And it's just important to understand that these battles are going to be, this sort of top-down, bottom-up dynamic is already unfolding in cities, and technology is at the heart of it. And so stuck in the middle are civic leaders and mayors. And I really think that in the end, it's going to be up to them to arbitrate whether we let IBM build a smart city or we tap citizens to do it in a more organic grassroots fashion. Because I think we have a pretty good sense of what the IBMs and Ciscos of the world can provide. They can provide efficiency. They're very good at designing systems that are secure. They are very good at designing systems that can increase the convenience of interacting with government or accessing a service. But the grassroots thing is a lot messier. And so, you look at this term civic hackers that's in the book. If you look around at the landscape, there are a phenomenal number of startups, NGOs like New America, individual developers and technologists who are building what I would think of as smart city technologies completely outside the bounds of government and industry. And just a few examples here that are emblematic of what's going on and how these people think about it. Open data. So New York City just released yet another trove of open data that they claim they're actually sharing more data now than the federal government is. And you've got several hundred cities around the country that are sharing transit data that's powering lots of apps. You've got entrepreneurs. This is an app called Exit Strategy here in the upper right-hand corner. It tells you where to stand on the New York City subway based on where you want to get out when you reach your destination. Right beneath that is an app called Ushahidi, which is a crisis mapping platform. It was originally developed to monitor election violence in Kenya and is now being used every time there's a big disaster. Someone sets up one of these and it allows people to send text messages, incident reports, so that people can start to crowdsource a picture of what's happening. And then the last example here is Air Quality Egg, which is an open hardware project to create an ozone sensor, because ozone pollution varies very heavily block to block in cities, but most cities only have, and it's incredibly toxic, but most cities only have like a dozen monitoring stations. So Paris has 10, New York has 12. So you have this very coarse grid that doesn't map to the pollution that's trying. So people are basically building this hardware very cheaply and encouraging others to stick them out their window. But there's so much going on in this sort of grassroots smart city landscape. It's really hard to figure out what it means. There's a lot of silos. It's not like the open source movement where everyone's talking to each other. And there's sort of a coherent philosophy and ideology of what they're trying to achieve through their individual little efforts. And so I went back in history kind of looking for precedents and guides. And I came across this, which is a great piece of California history, I guess, with this clipper ship sailing into some bright, happy sunset. This is the cover of the first newsletter of the People's Computer Company, which was sort of just before the Homebrew Computer Club, which you may have heard about, which is where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak showed the Apple for the first time, the Apple computer. And what it says at the top, I think, really captured what I was seeing in this smart city landscape. And it says, computers are mostly used against people instead of for people, used to control people instead of to free them. Time to change all that. We need a People's Computer Company. And it's really utopian, but you got to understand, this is at a point where personal computing is just happening, and this massive democratization of information processing is about to hit the world. And we're living in the world that followed from that. And I think that's very similar to what's going on now. So, your smartphone is basically like 10 times more powerful than the Cray 1, right? Which was installed at Los Alamos around this time. And you use it to play video games, but it's actually capable of doing so much more. Things like Arduino, which is this very inexpensive technology for doing what's called physical computing, creating applications that bridge cyberspace and the real world. Open data. So the tools are out there and they're spreading very quickly. And so, I started to think about, okay, if Robert Moses is the metaphor for how you would build a smart city from the top down as a central planner, who's the cheerleader? Who's the sort of intellectual ancestor to building smart cities from the bottom up? And I ran into this guy. Scary looking, isn't he? Yeah. He was a genius. His name is Patrick Geddes. He was actually one of the sort of founders of city planning as a field in Britain in the late 19th century. And unlike most of his peers who were civil engineers and architects, he was an evolutionary biologist. And he was also an avid gardener. So his view of the city and how cities grow and how you should design and plan them was totally antithetical to the way that his colleagues, I'll show somebody in a second, who basically wanted to blow the Victorian industrial city away with all of its coal soot and poor people and horses, these dirty animals that people were co-inhabiting cities with. Geddes instead basically wanted to prune cities and garden them. And so he, when he got married as a young man, he with his new wife, moved into one of the poorest sections of central Edinburgh and bought the whole top floor of a tenement block and proceeded over the next couple decades to basically redevelop his neighborhood through tiny little interventions. And it struck me that this is the way that we should be thinking about doing this. Instead of having IBM come and install a building that's going to control the whole city, we should be thinking about how to empower people to draw on all these newly available democratized technologies to craft their own solutions. I'll skip that. And one of the other things that was really interesting about Geddes was that he did believe that the only way that urban revitalization would work is if every single person participated. It wasn't something you could leave to professionals or to government. Everybody had to participate. And so he sort of set out to educate the population. He basically believed that people didn't understand how cities worked, and that they need to be taught how cities work so that they could understand where they fit into it and where their little action would make a difference. So he built this thing called the Outlook Tower in central Edinburgh. And the way that this worked is you would come in and you would go up the staircase to the top, which was a camera obscura, and you would sit in the camera obscura and you'd see the silhouette of the region's landscape around you. So you'd start with this like big bird's eye view, and then you would dive deeper down to understanding like what's going on, you know, on an individual city block. And then you would get kicked out the front door and you'd be in Edinburgh, and it's like sort of, what do I do now? How do I take this new knowledge of how the city works to change it? And I just thought that was a fascinating way of thinking about you know, how people should participate. How do you teach them how a city works and what all the key technological things that are happening and how that's changing the city? And then how do you inspire them basically to participate? And the shorthand that Geddes used for this idea of a scientific understanding of the city and then applying it, changing the city, was what he called civics, okay? And I was intrigued by that word when I came across it in his writing, because we often think of civics as you know, something like this, participating, you know, sort of an individual code of conduct, right? So this is See, Click, Fix, which is an app I'm sure many of you have used, where you can basically press a button and raise your hand and say, hey, I see a pothole. And you know, the idea that that's what we think of as civics. And for Geddes, it was much more. It was about drawing on all of the new science of the day: sociology, economics, law, political science, and using that to act in an informed way. And so when I got to the end of the book, I basically decided I need to come up with a new civics for smart cities. I didn't want to prescribe a vision of utopia, of a great smart city. I wanted to basically give people a checklist or a scorecard that they could use when they looked at anything that came down the pipe, whether it's something IBM is doing, whether it's something an open source project is doing, whether it's something like Commotion, the wireless project that's going on here at New America, and just give them like a scorecard to match it up against and say, is this good design or not? Is this increasing exclusion or not? Is this creating more risk of failure or not? And so what I'd like to do just in the last few minutes is run through 13 tenets of this new civics for smart cities that I came to. And you know, this is sort of, I think, the piece in the book that's not descriptive. It's really speculative, and it's basically what I want to spend the next couple of years debating with people. So I hope you'll find something to dig into. So the first of these principles is opting into smart. And I got a great little animation here. Boom. I really feel like the aggressive push by these technology companies over the last couple of years has carried a sense of inevitability around it. And when you hear them talk about it, this is the only way to address these really pressing urban problems. And I think we need to be cautious about that, but we also need to make sure that we're not Luddites. So if you make an investment in a city, you know, say laying a new road, put conduit in it to future-proof it, so that if you do want to lay some infrastructure down there in the future, you can do that. I was just talking to, I can't remember what city it was, but they were telling me that they're installing a new set of lamp posts for streetlights, and they're going to have a little box in there that can accommodate future sensors if people want to deploy noise sensors or air sensors, they'll have the physical space to plug it in there. The second, this is should be no argument to the people here. Industry has been very slow to cover this country in broadband infrastructure. I just found it today. I had no idea. Verizon's new ad for Fios it features Marky Mark in Copley Square in Boston talking about how great Fios is. You know who hasn't built Fios in Boston? Verizon. And they've said they never will build there. They'll never deploy Fios in Boston because it costs too much for them to pull the wires. They say they can never recover their capital investment, and that just blew my mind.
There's more to that story. I'll tell you.
Okay. So, to me, I think that's I think that's just an unacceptable state of affairs. But as projects like Commotion are showing, the technology, I think, is here for people to build their own broadband, or for people to mobilize their own community's resources, as they've done in Chattanooga, where the electric power company, which is municipally owned, has deployed a gigabit network. Second thing, this is kind of a technical piece, but a lot of what's driving these companies very aggressively into smart city marketplace is to secure almost like an unassailable position. I won't call it a monopoly because I don't think it is a monopoly. But this is a chart that was thrown out by Living Planet, which was trying to build a smart city in Portugal that failed, and they've since sort of regrouped in London. But they tried to trademark the term urban operating system. And we're very brazenly talking about how if they deployed their software, it would control everything that happens in the city. And I think I think we need to think about smart cities and standards for smart cities that are more like the web and less like an operating system. So sort of loosely coupled standards that allow different infrastructures to talk to each other. The next one is what I call extended public ownership, not ownership. That's a typo. This is a picture of Daniel Sarasa, who manages a project called Digital Mile in Zaragoza in Spain. And it's sort of a comprehensive program of all different kinds of activities to try and turn Zaragoza into a smart city. But one of the really low-tech pieces of it is the citizen card that he is showing. And they've signed up about 20% of the city in less than a year. And so this unlocks the bike share. It's the way you get onto Wi-Fi. It lets you pay for the bus. It's your library card. And it's very popular, and they're collecting tons of data about how people use the city. And I said to him, I was like, aren't you concerned about the liability of that? Which is what any US municipal official or employee would say. He said, oh, no. He said, we think this is an important role for us to play, that we can be a trusted intermediary between citizens and industry, who would love to collect and use this data. And there's a lot of issues there, and this privacy fulcrum is going to be, giving us headaches for 20 years, I'm sure. But to me, it was just a really different way of thinking about this. And we've seen this idea of public ownership over the data that a smart city generates come to the front in many different places. The whole scandal a couple of years ago with San Francisco and the company that Nextbus, that was supplying its real-time arrival data for the bus network. That's my cue to shut up. I'm just going to wrap up with a few more of these. They basically had to threaten to break the contract with this company so that they could share that real-time arrival data with developers so they could build apps. And that's a situation that I think a lot of cities get themselves into, particularly as the vendors see more and more value in the data they can harvest from these projects. So modeling transparently, I think the excitement around open data is great, but I'm more concerned about the code that powers the decision support tools that cities use. So if you've got ambulances being dispatched based on some piece of software that may have assumptions built into it that aren't in line with policy or aren't equitable, you have to surface that so that people can see it. There's a great book called The Fires, written by a guy named Joe Flood, which talks about the model of response time that Rand built for the New York City Fire Department in the early 1970s, and how pig-headed some of the assumptions were, and the terrible, terrible human financial costs of the closures that came after they built that model. This is a model that IBM built for Portland a couple years ago. And it was based on decades-old ideas about how to model cities. And it was really an example of, and the mayor basically ended up seeing it as an oracle that could predict what would happen if he made certain decisions. And it's a very strong case of why these things need to be subject to public scrutiny. The next one, graceful failure. This is a picture of Tokyo. That's really weird. I thought that was like Japanese music playing as I showed this picture, because it's not in my presentation. This is after the Fukushima meltdown, and without electric power, your smart city is kaput. I interviewed IBM's sort of main mind behind their Smarter Cities project, and he was very blasé about the risks of all these new technologies and our dependence upon them. He said, society rides a number of tigers, like chemical fertilizer, electric power, and I said, I was just shocked that he was that blasé about it. You look at, my biggest pet peeve right now is the reliability of cell networks, because I had to sit through a week-long outage after Sandy. If you look at what happened after the Boston bombing, there's a lot of evidence that the investigation was compromised in the early hours because the cell networks were overloaded. So we need to understand how to make these things more resilient. This is what I'm really interested in, build locally, trade globally. There's a lot of evidence that different cities are wasting a lot of money rebuilding the same technologies, and they're doing it with local vendors who may not be the best to do it. But there's also a whole host of organizations. This is Living Labs Global. Code for America is another good example, that are trying to cross-fertilize the best innovations and smart city services from one city to another. And so they're sort of circumventing the role of McKinsey's or IBM's who would have done this in the past. And I think it's a really good development. Cross-training designers. I think we need to train people who are skilled both at understanding cities and how cities work, as well as how information technology, information systems work. I put these 4 people up here because I think they're probably the only 4 people in the world that can really do that in almost a transdisciplinary way. And I think back about Red Burns, who I talk a lot about in the book. She founded the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU. She just passed away a couple weeks ago, sort of like the NYU's Media Lab. And the way she used to think about how they were training students there, she said, we are training a new kind of professional, one who's comfortable with both analytical and creative thinking. And I think, we need to do that, as well as people who have expertise in the 2 relevant domains. I hope no one gets offended by this. This is probably, as an urban planner, the most exciting thing that came out of the research to me. The idea that people would use real-time data to draw attention to long-term issues. So this is an app that somebody in Boston built when the transit agency started publishing their next train arrival times. And basically, in very provocative language, it asks you, how bad is this system performing? And by showing you what's happening right now. And when you look at this, you start thinking, well, why is it so screwed up? Is it because of lack of long-term investment in track maintenance, rolling stock? Is it because there's labor issues? What is it about the system that's making my train not show up? And I think there's a bunch of organizations now that are trying to explore how you can use very simple indicators of what's happening right now. So, how are schools doing? Getting better, getting worse? How's crime doing? Getting better, getting worse? And then injecting that into the places where people talk about local issues, corner stores, schools, libraries, and potentially reversing the planning process so that communities actually start the planning process instead of responding to what governments do. We're almost at the end here. Crowdsourcing with care. There's a lot of excitement around crowdsourcing as a strategy for enabling some of these bottom-up smart city projects. But this is a great booklet from 1929, the Regional Plan Association in New York, and they were trying to explain to people the need for planning, and they had this great set of pages. Some crowds are good, a parade, a church, the carefree holiday crowd. And then the next page, some crowds are bad. Crowded subway platforms, mobs rioting. And I think, we've certainly seen this, through distributed denial of service. There are a lot of times when crowdsourcing is dangerous, when it's inequitable, because in many cases it's tantamount to privatization. And you have to make sure that people who don't have the resources can actually participate. Connect everyone. So this is came from a Wired article touting how great it was that New York City is using its 311 data to allocate city resources. But in every city that I've spoken to, when they've looked into it, they've found that 311 is disproportionately used by native English speakers. So this is the most accessible smart city system there is. It uses terminals that are everywhere. It's always on. It's always available in major language groups in these cities. You don't have to be literate to use it, yet it is like noticeably exclusionary. And if it's used as a triage tool for public managers, they're then directing resources to the most well-off people who are screaming the loudest. And so I think signals like that tell me that the more complex, the more nuanced systems are just going to have all kinds of inequities scattered throughout them, literally programmed into them. I'm going to skip this one because we're running out of time, but I just want to finish on where I ended up at the end, thinking again about big data and data exhaust and looking through all the data that cities are producing for weak signals that can allow us to manage it better. And there's certainly a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it's exciting to think about how can you use cell phone location data to do better transportation planning because you know where everyone's going. And once you address all the privacy and whatever around that. But it got me thinking, I had a young student walk into my office with this app. He had a prototype for a lost and found app. And basically the idea was he was going to incentivize a community of finders that people who would lose things could go to and say, go find my thing. I think I lost it here. And we'll make a reward, and it'll be this great social interaction of actually returning the object. And so you're almost like deputizing people as search agents in the city. And it didn't work out, but it was just really novel because I started thinking, like, if IBM designed the same system, their solution would be to tag everything in the city, to put up scanners at every corner, and then put a giant search appliance on top of that so you could be, where are my keys, and then it would tell you where the keys are. And they would both work, more or less, but the one would make us more human, it would reinforce social cohesion, it would do all of these things that the one that just solved it in the background, using basically mass surveillance, would not do. And the potential for misuse of that instrument once you put it in place. What I love about Rio is that they've got this very progressive Democratic mayor who at least says he's putting all this surveillance technology in place on behalf so that he can protect the poor. It's very paternalistic, but it seems to work in Brazil. But what happens when the bad guy gets in office or takes power and all that apparatus is there for him to control the citizenry? In the section about smart grid, I imagine what if an autocrat comes to power in a city that has a smart grid and decides, I'm gonna brown out the neighborhoods that didn't vote for me or that don't support me. And I can do it in such a sophisticated way that they'll be miserable, but they won't be angry enough to openly revolt. And it's that kind of really like fine-tuned, precise control in very insidious ways that really worries me about some of these visions of smart cities. So I'm gonna stop there. It's a lot of information, and I hope I didn't overwhelm you at the end of a long day, but this is a big book. It's 400 pages, it weighs 1.5 pounds, and I just felt the need to share a bit of it with you. So thank you very much. Too long, was it?
So thank you. While my colleagues are taking their chairs, just to get a sense of the room, who here is more of an urbanist or somebody who comes from a city's interest in this discussion? Okay, and who is maybe more of a technologist, comes from that side? And policy discussion, the policy wonks? Okay, we've got a pretty good distribution, and we're going to cover all that. If you read the book, also there's a line towards the end where Anthony asks, he says he often gets asked, well, which is the smartest city? And that he usually, his answer every time is yours. And I told him that he probably should not do that in this city, certainly not right now. But I do think that this room certainly has a lot to offer, both in the chairs that you're seated in and up here. Again, I'll introduce them as they talk. But first, We'll hear from my colleague, Greta Byram, who's a senior policy analyst with the Open Technology Institute.
Actually, I'm a senior field analyst.
Oh, senior field analyst.
Thanks a lot, and Anthony, thanks. That was great. Really, so much to think about and so much to chew on. So I just want to take a couple steps back, and mostly I'm going to talk about the field and what we do at OTI and how we kind of engage with some of these issues. But first, I want to take a couple steps back and just think a little bit about what is a city. So first of all, is a city like a collection of buildings? Is it transportation infrastructure? Or is it the people that live there? And I think that helps us think a little bit about what some of the goals might be of making a city smarter. And from my perspective, one of the things that really makes a city a vibrant and interesting place is actually friction. And the friction between different groups of people that may see things in different ways. But that's the kind of productive friction that has produced places that are so rich in culture, where you have sort of unexpected combinations of food or music or what have you. So I want to just begin by questioning the whole sort of goal of rationality or efficiency, which I think Anthony also definitely does in his book, and just think about some of the really productive and interesting things that we find in urban environments because there's friction. Of course, there's a flip side to that, and any planner who's ever been to a public meeting knows what I'm talking about, and Anthony touched on this as well. So it's, usually in urban planning programs, you have to go to a public meeting just to see like what happens to the best laid plans. And so obviously public discourse and public participation can be remarkably inefficient and can really throw a wrench in the works. But I want to think about what are some of the positive things that emerge from participation and from that kind of friction. And I'll, sort of with the more sinister, I think what Anthony talks about is the more sinister side of centralization and rationality that are on the flip side of that. So, what I think, you didn't talk about Ben Flyberg, but I think he's actually an interesting example of somebody who talks about how rationality and centralization can really threaten the diversity and, the multiple kinds of cultural viewpoints that exist in cities. So what we do at OTI is we really try to do, what Anthony suggested, which is planning from the ground up, so planning sort of backwards, so starting with communities and thinking about what they want and helping them to be the decision makers and the planners who are creating actually what I would call smart interventions in those places. So the primary example I'll talk about is Detroit, where we've worked with community leaders of all ages, and actually, so there's a huge range of who's participating, but we have worked in a sort of networked way, which touches also on Anthony's point about building a web, not an operating system. So we try to really engage with multiple kinds of people across the city, and talk to them about what their goals are, and using the platform Commotion, which is a technology that enables people to build their own telecommunications infrastructure. So these are Wi-Fi networks that are planned and built by people themselves. We help people make their neighborhoods smarter, and we really work on the scale of the neighborhood and think about instead of data, for instance, being consolidated and aggregated at a city level, what happens really when technological resources are spread about just on the scale of the neighborhood and data is retained by the people in that neighborhood. So we run a training program in Detroit, and at this point we have, I can't remember, it's five networks right now that are community planned, community owned. The decisions about these networks are made by the communities. So these aren't hyper efficient networks. But these are networks for which the people that use them are deciding what they look like, where connectivity is going to go, what kind of information is going to be retained, how privacy is going to work on that network. And for us, that's been a really interesting experiment in, planning from the ground up, and also in inefficiency. And I would say, like, from our perspective, that inefficiency is actually a very productive kind of tension that creates a really interesting sort of network of networks, or sort of a patchwork quilt that's starting to cover parts of Detroit with a kind of infrastructure that's really been lacking there. So I'm happy to talk more about that and relate it more to some of the models that Anthony's suggesting, but I do think it's really intriguing to think about a type of smart city which is much more modular and much more dispersed and not centralized, unlike the kind of model that IBM and Planet are suggesting.
Yeah, as Greta pointed out, we have both policy analysts and field analysts with OTI. Lena Kahn is a policy analyst with Markets, Enterprise, and Resilience Initiative here at New America Foundation.
So our program looks more at corporate consolidation across the economy and the effects of that on us as citizens. So I think alongside kind of the need to be very aware about the role of civic involvement, we need to really be thinking about control and ownership. So, who is controlling the infrastructure of our new cities, who is owning that information? What does it mean for private companies to be purveyors of public information? Is this a form of just digitally enhanced public services, or is it a form of privatization? And as Anthony discusses in his book, these aren't new questions. We've grappled with them as a country before. And I think it's useful to consider some of the changes during the late 19th, early 20th century, where we similarly had a lot of major technologies reshape civic and commercial life. One city at that time that was kind of bang at the center of all this was Chicago, which, because of its location, its geography, was able to attract a lot of capital and end up becoming a trading hub. So anytime there were goods moving from east to west or west to east, they all stopped in Chicago. One of the kind of unsung innovations of that time was the steam-powered grain elevator, which essentially replaced human labor with these massive conveyor belts and allowed the city to store up to like 10 times the grain it had previously had. And that really boosted Chicago as this trade center, but what the city quickly realized was that it also consolidated a lot of power among a few grain elevators. And as a result, it was only the grain elevators that Huron knew how much grain there was in the system, in the city. So all of a sudden, information that had previously been public was now privatized in a handful of companies. And this really caused a lot of disruption for the city. It hurt a lot of ship owners, a lot of farmers. It was only the grain elevators who really knew at any moment whether there was a shortage, whether there was a surplus, and they were able to use that information to place huge speculative bets. And what ended up happening was that Chicago actually just passed a law declaring that that information had to be public. So, the grain elevators had to publicly report the statistics about how much grain there was in the system. They had to allow public inspectors to go inside and check that these numbers were accurate. And a few years later, the Supreme Court actually followed up on that and ended up also ruling that these kinds of public infrastructure had to be subject to some levels of public oversight. So I think these are just kinds of questions that we need to be asking of IBM and Siemens. Do they own this information? Are there limits to what they can do with that information? It's great if IBM is helping me and my neighbors monitor our electricity usage, but is there anything preventing them from then selling that information to financial traders who can then, place huge bets on which way the prices are going to move? For somebody to know that demand of electricity on my block peaks at 7:18 p.m. is an extremely lucrative piece of information. So I think we need to start thinking about, how do we want to set the parameters of how it can be used. I think one additional point worth noting is that our earlier experience really led us to pass a whole arsenal of new laws and regulation, identifying how these fantastic technologies and the immensely powerful companies that controlled them could shape our lives. So, in 1887, we created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was the first regulatory agency in the country that regulated railroads and ensured that they weren't discriminating among us. We passed antitrust laws. We created the Federal Trade Commission. So there was this national movement to comprehensively address the range of powers that these companies now had over us. By contrast, today, we really haven't seen any sort of comprehensive effort at that level. We've seen, piecemeal regulation, occasional investigation, but we haven't really seen anything that addresses the scope of these new powers. And if anything, we've actually gone in the exact opposite direction. So federal courts in the last few years have radically emboldened corporate rights. A recent trend is for companies to use the First Amendment in a way where they can claim corporate speech rights. So one case that's actually relevant to some of the stuff we're talking about is there was a health IT company that for a while was buying up prescription records of millions of Americans and then selling that information to pharmaceutical companies who would then target doctors who would then sell more expensive medicine to us. There were a few states that decided maybe this invaded Americans' privacy, and they decided to pass a law banning it. The companies then actually came back and said that selling this information was a form of free speech, and that for the states to ban it was actually violating on their corporate free speech rights. So this case ended up going to the Supreme Court, which sided with the company, and so the practice is now legal. So, if I were a lawyer for Siemens or IBM, I would feel pretty great that this is the kind of tool I now have at my disposal that if I wield right, I have a good chance of succeeding. So all of which is to say, companies can play a very fruitful role in helping our cities adapt to all the great new technologies that we have, but we collectively need to think very carefully about what the boundaries are between private and public information and ensure that this is a collective conscious effort by cities, by citizens, and it's not something that we just kind of leave to be either implicitly emerged or to play out in courts. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lena. And Reed Kramer is the director of the Asset Building Program.
Thank you. I did enjoy the book a great deal. So there's something for everybody out there. You can get yours on the way out. That's the ad. It really had something for everyone. A model of a good book has maybe many audiences. And yes, there's something for the technologist and the policy types and the urban planning student. It does tap into this really a new set of dynamics that are impacting cities and that they're having to kind of navigate in a very contemporary way. These emerging technologies, they've impacted the way cities work, how people interact with one another, and really how urban life is unfolding. It was really a pleasure to get back to my urban planning roots and read some of the way he was looking at the history, taking it back to this kind of post-industrial regional planning efforts, and then the battles between the master builder and the community activist, epitomized by Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. But really, there's some new ways of looking at old themes, which is the disruptive, power of technology, but also that can create these opportunities and challenges. And so, yeah, now we have a wide range of data that's out there that if we can, capture it and analyze it and organize it, marshal it effectively, we can make, systems work better. We can impact our infrastructure and our service delivery. And we also can create places that bring people together in very new and diverse ways that are really satisfying. So that's the promise of a lot of this work. But he's, really no utopian. There's a lot of peril in it too, and I think what Lena touched on is, I think, relevant here. We can allow our public spaces to shrink. We can create kind of soulless, soul-crushing places to live. The description of this place in Korea in the book was very dramatic for me and made me shudder at several points that would never want to live there. So yeah, there's a lot of tension between this public and private sphere. A couple of years ago here at the New America Foundation, we launched a think tank effort, which we called the Next Social Contract. And it was really a way for us to get our heads around some of these tensions. We wanted to look at trends in the economy and in the demography and technology to really look at how it was kind of impacting and maybe transforming the basic deal of the social contract. And really, we tried to look at what the basic rights and responsibilities were for the basic parties of the contract. So beyond looking at the citizen and the family and government, we were also trying to consider the actions of the private sector, of business, as well as civil society. And then we were, this didn't provide all the answers. It was a framework to kind of elevate this discussion and identify some principles that could inform policymakers. And there was many dimensions to that. I think it'll be very familiar to Anthony with his work, but it was an opportunity to look at, begin to ask some questions about what citizenship should mean. What should that entail? Another was, what are the expectations of government? And I guess for this conversation, I want to emphasize that really government has a responsibility to work. And this is true at all levels of government, but especially cities and these kind of urban areas, and who are often given the challenge of managing the delivery of services and an infrastructure. And then cities also must be governed. And certainly technology is going to play a role, but it does create these uncertainties. Who's going to control and deploy the technology? Who's responsible for failure? What are the expectations? And really, I bring this up because there is this enduring tension, which comes out in the book and also in Lena's comments, between the public and the private sphere. Certainly, in some of my work, my colleagues' work at OTI, they emphasize that data really can empower, but it also, people don't have access to it, it can marginalize as well. So I think we do need a new set of principles to guide this basic concept of what the next social contract should look like. And I think that I'm very partial to a lot of what Anthony identified as some of his first principles about making it transparent and resilient systems and human-centered systems and things that do include people. And I think those are great places to start. And I guess I want to emphasize just two places that I would like to continue to elevate in this conversation. One is to really embrace the concept of public assets. I mean, he referred to it as ownership. I think there's also collective resources that have value that we need to think about, as a society, in a broader conversation. So previously, we thought about the air we breathe. That changed really quickly. 10 years ago, my colleagues here at the New America Foundation were looking at the spectrum as a public asset, which needs to be governed, considering kind of collective needs. And obviously now we're seeing that data is another example of a public asset that has value. And the new civics needs to recognize that we all play a role in creating this, and we need to kind of recognize that and build from it. So second, I think the new civics really also needs to embrace in a very full way this concept of inclusivity and really examine what it means. So many in the tech world did a great service by identifying the presence initially of this emerging digital divide. Many were accessing the wonders of the internet. Many were kept out. In the book he updates it, and he mentioned it, this concept, even these new tools like 311 in New York, is having different kinds of impact in different communities. So, I think we can make the case for, thinking about community access and even broadband projects that are kind of seeking to fill this void, but expand our concept of inclusivity even a bit further. We should be asking, what are the resources that people need to navigate their lives? How do we make sure people get access to them and can be included? I think in our work, these might be the private resources, the family resources. We often focus in my program on connecting people to financial services, which right now is still done in a very uneven way, giving people the opportunities to save and build up their own asset pool that they can deploy. And even how people connect to the public assistance programs that kick in when people fall on hard times or need long-term support. So, cities need to be places where there are viable safety nets, and often make do with limited resources to do that, to manage those systems effectively. So there's a range of ideas and a reform agenda around some of this work that connects cities and the process of governing to providing these services and including more people. And it might take us away from kind of the syncing up traffic lights and crowdsourcing, but I think it's a very important effort that will also be a part of making the city smarter.
Yeah, so I'd like to just Anthony to have a chance to respond to some of those comments if you've.
I really appreciate the attention and thought to the work in those comments. And one thing that occurred to me as you were all speaking was, I really did try to go back to sort of our great wave of city building in the developed world, which happened around the turn of the century, second half of the 19th century, and look at, what were the technologies that we introduced to deal with rapid urbanization, and what can we learn about what's happening in the developing world right now? And that story about Chicago, I think, is fascinating. But you look at the telegraph and the huge crisis of information processing around the 1880 US Census, which took 7 years to tabulate. I mean, it was the biggest census ever, and it was big because Congress had authorized all these extra questions, because they were a bunch of rural landowners who were totally freaked out by industrial urbanization. And so the company that built that machine is the company that became IBM. And so there's this long sort of thread that connects the people that are building these tools now and the people that built them then. I hadn't really thought about the whole kind of regulatory response of that time, and it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions about what level of government is that going to happen at. I mean, you cited the local example in Chicago, but then also the more comprehensive effort to get a rein on trade, the new system of trade, the new networks of urban trade at the national level. And I just yesterday I was at the sort of victory lap conference for the Bloomberg administration in New York, City Age, which was organized by Aspen. And Ben Barber, who's a political scientist, is touting his new book called If Mayors Ruled the World. And then I drive down to DC, where we have a non-functioning national government. And I don't...
local government.
Well, yeah, I mean, the buses are running. Nobody's going to work on them, but I don't really buy into this whole idea that, cities are taking over, and at someday Mike Bloomberg's money is going to run out, and I think that idea of mayors ruling the world is going to run out. But it raises some really interesting questions about, where's the innovation happening? Who's actually tackling global problems in an urgent fashion, and in a way that engages citizens? And most of that's happening at the local level. But on the other hand, I don't think states are going away anytime soon. Ray Kelly can have his intelligence officers in Israel and Singapore, but I mean, they're not going to defend New York City from a foreign power. So there's all these things going on that I think are making cities much more important in the overall framework of governance, precisely because they're dealing with the emerging issues that these structural changes in the economy and technology are driving. So, I was excited to come down here to think, well, what do the questions in the book mean in a national policy context, not having thought that much about it. And, I worry that it's going to be a real struggle to translate, what the innovative mayors in the biggest cities in the country are doing to what's happening at the national level. So,
I think that there's another thing I heard, which was, what is the right scale of these questions? So Greta was saying, well, there's cities, but really a lot of experience happens at the neighborhood scale, and Reed was speaking about households and families and that scale, and so there's also that interplay. And I wonder if you've thought about even the question of what a city is. Is it the geographic boundaries of the municipality? Is it the metropolitan statistical area, the greater metro region? So really, what is the scale that we should be thinking about the engagement with these technologies?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, what I was trying to do in the book was to inspire people to not sit back and let it be handled through a business transaction between a big multinational company and a couple of people in City Hall, that they really need to wade in and get their hands dirty.
Are there any questions or contributions from the audience? Oh wait, we are participating in the internet revolution, so please wait for the microphone.
If
Oh
you could
boy.
just say your name and if you want.
Yeah,
where
Christophe Toulouse, interested citizen. You didn't mention, I haven't read the book, but I suspect it's an issue as well with this Siemens, IBM assault on cities. And I know that there are city leaders around the country who are seriously wondering, how do I deal with these people who are coming across my threshold? And either from a technology side, promising whatever it is that they have to promise, or from a sustainable development perspective, what it is that any number of groups are offering. And one of the questions I have for you is there an analog here with our energy system in the country, and I suspect other big systems that we have, which, if over-centralized, actually make us much, much less resilient. And so, for example, if we're dependent on this massive command center in Rio, in D.C., the power goes off on a beautifully clear, sunny day, So what are the implications of those kinds of problems? That is one of the things that I guess big data is supposed to help us solve, but obviously hasn't yet.
So I have a whole, the second to last chapter in the book, the title is Buggy, Brittle, and Bugged. And it's it's the dystopia chapter. It's all the flaws, the emperor wears no clothes kind of perspective. But the point about resilience is a really important one, and I can tie it back to the New America Foundation, because I live in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is along the Hudson River, totally inundated by Superstorm Sandy. And not just citizens, but our city government, our police, fire, pretty much lost all communications for about 8 days. I mean, we were foot messengers, basically, was how information was getting out. And we never want that to happen again. And so we're basically trying to build a solar-powered mesh wireless network that will sit on rooftops, strategic rooftops around the city, and it'll use software developed by New America, by Open Technology Institute called Commotion, that allows us to very cheaply and quickly build out this infrastructure. And I think it's that kind of thinking that, to me, it sounds on the face of it like a barn raising, but we're actually going to build a significant infrastructure through that project. It's not just playing around. It's not a hobby. And the next time we have a serious disaster, everyone's going to look to us. I'm hoping that becomes a model. So that's sort of, I think, how that resilience issue starts to inform the way you design these things and who owns them and who's involved in maintaining them at a local level. At a larger level, I'll just tell you a story that illustrates how crazy and out of hand this can get. Because a lot of this is going to happen totally, a lot of the systems that run the city are going to be totally outside of public control. So I was in Israel last November, and I was talking to an engineer at the company that I was working with there. He said, we have this app, Waze, that was developed here. It's a crowdsourcing traffic app, free turn-by-turn navigation. And in the summer of 2011, about half the country was on that app. Google since bought it for like $1 billion. It's an amazing app. But there was, you guys probably remember, there was a pretty crazy series of thunderstorms that rolled through this region, one of which knocked a tree down, that knocked a power line down, that knocked out Amazon's Ashburn data center. Well, turns out that was where Waze, the brains of Waze, was in that data center. So a tree falls in Northern Virginia, and the entire country of Israel is in gridlock for 6 hours. That, to me, is amazing. And tie it back to what IBM is doing. In Rio, they put the data center in Rio, but the business model for that solution is that you don't build the biggest screen in Latin America. You don't build a new building. You just have a web screen that you're getting that smart city command center on. And who knows where the data center will be when they want to sell it to Kigali in Rwanda, which they don't have millions of dollars. They'll only pay $10,000 for it. And IBM's got to figure out how to centralize that service delivery to a point where they can make money. And so, what if Kigali's smart city is in Armonk, New York, or Ashburn, Virginia? How do they ever exert any control over it? I don't know. And there's this huge trade-off between efficiency and scalability and resilience that is very, very risky.
You just gave two examples of non-resilient systems, and one was in the public sector and one was in the private sector. And it's obviously, we have expectations as citizens. We want our government to work. We also are expecting the relationships we have with the private sector to work as well. It reminded me when I was reading that chapter a couple days ago of the rollout of this the Obamacare system. So you had all these websites, and everybody went on day one, and they got some wait times, and they're blaming the coders, or they're blaming the government, they're blaming Obama. Then I saw people blaming the code as well, and not to kind of adjudicate that conflict right here, but anyway, the expectation was that we need this to work, and I thought it was a revealing moment.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Catherine Marin-Sinha, also just private citizen. Quick question that you sort of touched on in your last answer regarding ownership principles, and sort of the idea of things being built out at a small scale, but then really successful systems being bought out by very large companies. And so if really successful systems are built at a small scale, but are then consolidated up, what are the ownership principles that you might sort of propose so that in 20 years we don't hit the same exact problems that you're talking about possibly happening now?
So I'm not sure I understand.
So if the system that you built in Hoboken, New Jersey was a really good system, who owns that? So if it works really well, if Google wants to buy it and then employ it everywhere else, how do these systems not become compromised by consolidation?
I think we're sort of following OTI's lead on this. I think the idea is that the ownership is distributed, and so we haven't even formed a nonprofit to advance this project, and we may never do it. We're asking volunteers to basically buy the equipment that they need to participate, whether that's an individual homeowner or a high-rise building that's professionally managed that wants to make sure they have backup. And I'm less scared of Google than I am of like Verizon and Cablevision, and because they have shown if Google wanted to take an interest in this project, I think they could probably only help. The telecommunications industry has demonstrated a capacity to do like precision strikes on these kinds of projects, or carpet bombing, depending on how you want to look at it. And so I want to not give them a target,
Yeah, no, I'll say that indeed the ownership of these kinds of projects is diversified. And I mean, I think we're talking about a specific example, and you might be talking more generic, but it's actually quite an interesting model. So, in the case of Commotion, if we lose like one particular node, so in a whole network of nodes, the network still functions. So let's say everybody owns their own piece of the network. Somebody drops out, it really doesn't matter. So there's no sort of collective ownership in that case. And I think this speaks, to Josh's question of like, what's the proper scale for something like this? Maybe there is no proper scale. And sort of the issue is with some of the large, with IBM's sort of concept is that it requires it to be centralized and it requires it to be on such a huge scale. But with the Commotion platform, that can be any scale. So like Anthony said, it can be a barn raising, it can be the size of a neighborhood or just a street or a few buildings, or it can be city scale. So it's infinitely sort of malleable.
Yeah, in the front.
I'm Richard Seeline. I'm a part of the Anthony Townsend fan club. First off, I'm not here, please, and Anthony knows this, as a defender of IBM and Siemens, but I've got to kind of jump in the fray on one part of this, and then there is a question. I have to do this the right way. The biggest owners of data in the United States and somewhat globally are these guys and these guys, not IBM and Siemens. BBVA, one of the largest banks in Spain, which is now one of the largest banks in the United States, has a massive data program. So does Capital One, so does Visa. So I kind of want to clarify that we may want to target IBM for spending $40 million on Smart Planet, which has been a failed business model for them. Siemens has some other things that, but I just want to state up front that the massive data owners are actually the ones who are trying to partner in some interesting ways. But now my question. So please don't accuse me of being a defender of IBM or Siemens, but just a clarification. Tony, I didn't realize when we talked about the book way, way back, and now listening to you, that the most important word on the front cover is the word civics. That what I think you've captured here is that there is a real transition in civic stewardship, civics at the basic city level, which may be the most profound key message that is the positive about the future of American cities. So I'd like you and the panel to kind of respond to that. If civics is really part of the revolution and the disruption here, 5 years from now, what do you think American cities are going to look like compared to global cities as a result of all of this?
Yeah, good. I mean, so you know, it's easy to pick on IBM and Cisco and Siemens because they're big. The reason I picked on IBM and Cisco in particular, of all the players that are looking to build businesses around our cities and our data, was that they were the two that most aggressively were trying to say, this is what the future looks like in a very comprehensive way. And again, I looked back and saw all these parallels to what GM did in the 40s and how influential it was and how misguided it was. And how little it examined unintended consequences. So they got beat up for that. And if you read the book carefully, actually, I drove up to Armonk to talk to people at IBM looking for a boogeyman, and actually found some pretty smart people who, as they got beat up in the marketplace, learned pretty fast. Cisco just bailed out. They had a short attention span. So in the end, I think I really have a lot of respect for the people at IBM who tried as hard as they could to meet the expectations that their marketers were setting. So the second piece, about civics, I think it's really exciting to see people confronting both these big global and local challenges using a pretty amazing array of technology components to work with. And this is sort of where this book is leading to with my work at the Institute for the Future going forward. And my colleague Jason Tester, who is leading this investigation into what we're calling maker cities over the next year. And we've launched a game. We're challenging people all around in the world to map what they think the future of their city is as a maker city, a place where people are using 3D printing and mesh Wi-Fi and do-it-yourself biotech to come up with solutions to pressing problems. And the organizing models and the kinds of spaces that their workspaces they're crafting for themselves. And I think there's just tremendous potential. And the part where it starts to get really tough to think about, though, is, and there's a section in the book where I sort of come to this question, I call it the need for urgent participation. And it's this idea that everybody has to participate, this Getty's idea, if we're going to fix the city, but we're running out of time. And that stuff is slow, and it's tremendously innovative, but it's slow, and it's messy, and it's complicated. And how do you accelerate that? And then how do you take the capacities that the IBMs and Ciscos do have, once you've got a good idea, to scale it and to lock it down and make it work under stress? You mentioned that the problems with the Obamacare websites. Like, I was astonished to find out that it was the Accentures and Deloittes of the world who had built those systems, and they didn't work, because I would have trusted them too. And so again, I think it's up to the mayors, the civic leaders, to say, like, there's all this energy here, there's all this expertise here. How do we plug it together? How do we plan it and design it so that it works and it gets done fast and we can afford it? But yeah, I'm very optimistic, and like I said, we're going to be going into communities all over the world, trying to understand, how people are trying to reinvent the systems of the 20th century for transportation, for healthcare, for food, production and distribution, basically, on their own using off-the-shelf parts.
And I think Lena's point and your point about the telecom companies' approach to community and municipal networks is there needs to be a regulatory framework that allows those types of local innovations to scale. Right?
Sure, yeah, and I don't think it's so much a question of are you assaulting the companies, are you defending the companies. I think even the volume of information that they're collecting is entirely a secondary issue. It's more a question of these are private companies in many ways providing what have traditionally been public services, and are we collectively as citizens deciding what those boundaries should be? So I don't mean to suggest there's some hierarchy of big bad companies and who's collecting the most information. I think it's more about being very explicit that we're asking the right questions and being cautious about setting those boundaries.
I'm not being paid by IBM.
So I think we have time for
very fair question.
For one more question.
Hi, Michael Nix, energy consultant here in town. On the FiOS issue, literally got an email today from a buddy with Verizon, will remain nameless, but it said it's a monetization issue. If they can get more market penetration, they feel they can do it, but they feel they're not getting enough market penetration. I live in DuPont, live on my laptop and cell phone and this kind of thing. It's been referred to as by Washingtonian Magazine as Laptopia. If you divide up Washington, we don't have FiOS in our neighborhood. So that's just an aside. I'm upset about it too. Every time I email this buddy at Verizon, I complain to him. Another complaint that I've had, talking about access to information, and this goes to the Chicago grain information. Been doing some work in green buildings, and the information that we can get from these buildings is to energy usage, appliances that are being used, how much energy is being used in the home and in various commercial residential buildings. And I've talked with some of the folks in the electric utilities about this and about access to that information, and I've been told blatantly, oh no, that's our information. That's not anybody else's information. And it's, I think it was almost a national security response that they gave to me that, oh no, we can't, your clients can't get that, Michael. That's our information. And it's just going to be, the electric utility with that information. Your thoughts on that? Because when you mentioned the grain, the information about who had amounts of grain in Chicago, and it was limited to just a handful of players, I'm kind of thinking this is a real similar, this is a comparative event, and I just kind of wanted to throw that up to the panel.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It sounds pretty analogous. There's actually a really interesting, speaking of analogies, there's really interesting things happening in rural America. Over the last few years, there's been an adoption of precision farming, where we've seen kind of the same kind of data analytics being used by a lot of farmers. So they're able to, collect granular information about the nutrients of their soil or, yield amounts. And there we're seeing a lot of the same issues where, a fertilizer company will come along and offer to start collecting this kind of information, and a farmer will pay it to do so. And then it'll decide that, it wants an independent agriculture economist to evaluate that information, and the company will say, nope, that's our information, you can't go ahead and do this. So it's, the farmer's land, the farmer's paying for the information, and yet when it comes down to it, he really has no control over it. So I think that's why we need to, be proactive about deciding who owns the information.
There's also another part of the conversation about FiOS, and I think there's maybe going to be a FiOS caucus after we break up. But is that there's an infrastructure that's needed to make all this run, and the infrastructure within cities and among cities is not evenly distributed, and so there's a market forces question about where any of these companies might want to provide smart city services. But even that decision is going to only be built based on, where the network is in place and where the consumers are there to, that they're we have a report that looks at the pricing of broadband and how that's a major factor, and there's disparities among cities, and I think that is an input that's going to fuel these business decisions by any of these companies. I didn't mean for that to be the last comment. Okay, take one more comment in the back.
Hi, I'm in here from California. I met with American Planning. They said I just have to come to this event. Have you guys been following what's going on with the compilation of a national parcel layer of the whole country, where you get down to a much finer grain on every city, and if you develop an app in one city, it works in every city or every county and town. This is going on, and it's enabled to get to a much finer grain than like the census tract, get down to individual houses and buildings. And a lot of homes are just one person, a single person household. You're literally looking right at people this way. But to watch cause and effect, to watch accountability, the notification, and on, is this anything that's even on your radar screen yet?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you aggregate data and make it available, you're going to create ways to infer things about individuals that violate their privacy. I remember when I was living in California, when I started working at the Institute for the Future, there was a startup down the street called, I think they were called Fat Door. I have no idea why. But basically, they were creating a social network of all the residences in the United States. And you had to go in and claim your residence in order to get them to stop sharing all this private information about you. It was sort of their way of incentivizing people to come in. And I remember being horrified by that. But, like, you can buy all that from Claritas or from BBVA or whoever, the data's out there. I think the question is publicly held data. What are the rules and processes by which you're going to decide what to share? And what we've seen with cities has been very risk averse in terms of what they put on their open data platforms to enable innovation. And it's a trade-off. And I just think it has to be much more systematic. I talked in the book about all the things we do around environmental impact assessment. We should have similar processes around smart city projects where you look at all the risks, all the benefits, you make an assessment, and then you mitigate. And like we know how to do this, we're just not doing it because the way it's being marketed is as a box that you just put in and you don't worry about. So that's the last word.
That is the last word. Thank you. We do have refreshments here as well as copies of Anthony's book. And again, I just want to thank the event staff that makes this possible and my colleagues Reed Kramer, Nina Khan, and Greta Byram. And again, thanks to Anthony Townsend for sharing his new book with us here. And thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.